I'm Abby Willard from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and really appreciate seeing so many people here today. Grateful that you took time out of your response and recovery moments as businesses impacted by this flood likely, and partners that have spent great effort in the preceding week plus in helping so many in need in your community. So it's great to see everyone and thank you for being here. The kind of purpose of our call today is, acknowledging how many farms are experiencing losses, feeling overwhelmed and discouraged at this time. Noting there's lots of property and crop and feed and forage losses that are ranging across the state, from many producers not being hurt and hit and others being dramatically impacted. There's been such a concerted kind of community outreach and engagement from day one of helping the ag community, as well as just our businesses and individuals across our communities. But one of the first questions that came out was how to manage flooded fields, and whether we're talking about inundated produce crops, about what can be consumed or sold, or forage crops and hay fields, pasture land, or stored feed. And so the intent of our conversation today is to really look to some of our great partners within the Agency of Agriculture and UVM Extension and others that are joining here today, to share some general resources, offer some best practices and guidance, and then really have the majority of the call be a question and answer, responding to people's circumstances, voicing what you're experiencing or what you may have questions around, and then looking to the collected community that we have on this call to help offer some guidance around next steps. So we only have 3 quick slides that I wanted to share. The first is really about just the housekeeping process of, we're going to really quickly introduce the panelists that we have joining us today. Reminding you again that when you join, if you're able to mute, that's helpful to keep background noise down. There's a majority of this hour together that will be spent answering questions. So you can, when we did these during COVID, we had to really focus on, the instructions and the reminders around how to use Teams. Most people have been in virtual meetings in the last 3.5 years, so it may not be as foreign, but you can unmute yourself and ask a question. You can raise your hand and wave it around. You can use the raise hand function within Microsoft Teams, which is located at the top of your bar with a little hand and it says raise beneath it. Or you can type a question in the chat. And we have Agency of Ag staff here, both Kira and Sarah, that are going to help field questions in the chat and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask and share during this time together. And again, just really grateful for having you join us. If there are folks affected by the flood or that would benefit from this information that aren't able to join during this hour, this is being recorded and the agency will post this on our website, I would suspect by the end of the day. So this slide just announces and introduces the 5 members that we asked within the agronomy community to be available to offer some brief perspective, connect you to some resources, and then be available as kind of the Q&A session engages. So many of you may be familiar with one or all of these individuals. They have been working in the field for a period of time, many for a long time, and are really well-known resources. So Dr. Haas is the state veterinarian for the state of Vermont, as well as the deputy director of our Food Safety and Consumer Protection Division at the Agency of Agriculture. Dr. Haas works with Tucker Diego, who's our agricultural products manager and manages many of the inspections of our Vermont produce program. And then Dr. Heather Darby from UVM Extension as an agronomist specialist, and 2 of her colleagues, Vern Rubinger and Becky Madden. So grateful that the 5 of you took time to join us and share some resources and some expertise with us today. So the last slide is just, and we can put the same information in the chat if that's helpful. The Agency of Agriculture has stood up a flood resources webpage, which is at agriculture.vermont.gov/flood, where you can access all sorts of resources, many of the resources that we'll be discussing and talking about today. And then a phone number and an email address if you ever have questions on any aspects of the flood response and recovery that will be responded to as quickly as we can. So trying to centralize resources and communication as best we can at the agency. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. And Tucker, I was hoping to sort of defer to you first if you're willing to talk a little bit about inundated floodwaters on produce. You're willing to go first. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. Again, my name is Tucker Diego with the Agency of Agriculture, and my main focus is on produce crops that are for humans. So not the animal feed side, but the human food side. And I've been talking with a lot of growers that had fields that were flooded, and trying to answer their questions about, can I harvest this crop, or can I replant, or a lot of those questions. I'm happy to field questions in this Q&A session. I just wanted to point out that we have put together some really good resources that we try and answer many of the common questions. And those resources are on our website at the link that Abby just mentioned, agriculture.vermont.gov/flood. Those resources were prepared in coordination with others on this, the other panelists on this call. And they may have more they want to talk on that. But the last thing I'd say is that if you call the agency, you have questions about what to do with your flooded crops that are for human food, you'll likely get directed to me, and I'm happy to talk through your questions one-on-one.
Thanks, Tucker. Maybe Vern and Becky, if we just sort of keep with the produce for human consumption side before we move to forage crops and stored feed. Any details that you want to offer around the resources that you help prepare, or kind of advice that you have?
Sure. A lot of people out there trying to be helpful. Some of the information is not so great to hear. Some of it's very clear around produce of what can't be sold or consumed. And then there's a whole area that is really up to the farmers. There's guidance, and that's where a lot of people are having some angst figuring out when should I go in and replant, because there's not a specific rule about that. And I'll just say there's a whole bunch of other stresses. This has been a really tough year for almost everyone growing crops of any kind, and between the freeze and the flood and the constant rain and the early part of the season where cash flow is not good. So there's a lot of good community spirit, but it's a tough year, and everyone's looking to where there might be some financial assistance coming. Oh, I guess I should mention there's the free soil testing for all flooded farm fields available through the UVM Ag and Environmental Testing Lab. It's the regular soil test plus a heavy metal screen, and the available nitrate test. You can get all of those to try and assess some level of risk. That does not assess other kinds of potential contaminants like fossil fuels. There's a test for that from Endyne Labs in Williston if people want to do it. But the microbial, both of those, I'll just say, when we had Irene, we did some testing. They were not found on flooded fields, so that gives some assurance. Not a guarantee it didn't happen this time. But the big concern is microbial contaminants, which are much more complicated to test for and really not practical to do. So the answer there is waiting and allowing time for those organisms to break down. And that's where the guidance comes in. Since we don't know exactly what's there in what quantity, the longer you wait, the better. And that's a hard answer to take when people want to replant, but that's the answer we have.
Thanks, Vern. Becky, anything that you want to add from the produce side?
Not right now, Abby. Thanks.
Okay.
I think echoing what Vern said and waiting for Q&A.
Great. All right. Dr. Darby, anything you want to offer just to introduce on the forage and field crop stored feed side? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Abby. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone for coming out today. This is great to have a captive audience to help answer some of the questions that are coming in. And I think it's really, for at least for us at this point, with corn, with some of the field crops, corn, hay, soybeans, small grains, we're really just really starting to see if things are going to recover, especially on the corn side, and or if they're going to die. So I've been going around to fields throughout the state of Vermont, really, providing some support and assessment to farms. But just even over a week's period, things have changed a lot, whether fields are starting to recover or actually starting to die. So corn crop was, in the middle of the season growth stage. So we had corn that was knee high all the way up to 7 or 8 feet tall. So every circumstance is really different. So people are worried about mycotoxins in corn silage, but honestly, at this point, there's nothing really we can do or check for because there's no ear and we're a couple months from harvest. So it's really checking those fields, watching them develop and understand what kind of damage we're going to see. And then as we get closer to harvest, really making some assessments around how to harvest, what to harvest, how to store inoculants and things like that. With hay crops, that's a different situation. People we're ready to harvest, second, third cut, or had just harvested. So again, preparing fields to chop feed off, unfortunately, that they would have otherwise had for their animals. And then with other crops, like soybeans and small grains, again, it's really on a case-by-case basis. So definitely ready for questions.
Great. Dr. Haas, we asked you to kind of join us from like a animal health veterinarian perspective. Is there anything you want to offer, or just turn it to Q&A and see if we get questions in that realm?
Yeah, I think turning it to Q&A would be a great use of time, given the large number of people, fortunately, that we have joining us. So thank you for including me, and happy to turn it over to that, Abby.
Okay, great. So we have one question in the chat, which I'm happy to reference while others sort of get themselves in the queue. So again, if you have questions that you want to ask, and again, this call's designed for you to say, hey, this is what's happening on our farm, or what we're experiencing, or what we're hearing, and create the opportunity for you to hear from those on the call that want to be helpful. So choose to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. But I think I'll start with the first question that's in the chat, which is regarding the purchase of horse hay for later in the season. Do we need to be concerned about anything in the hay from floodwater, and how hard it's going to be to buy hay this year? We also found really high sugar in the early hay this year, and any idea what the large amount of water in the fields may do to grass? Are there any resources for finding hay in the state? And are there any hay testing sites in the state?
I can
Okay,
take.
well, I can.
Oh,
Oh, good. Thank you, Kirsten.
I was gonna say I could take a stab at that or answer partially and then Heather turn it over to you for your perspective if that works.
Okay.
Okay, so in answer to the first question, yes, we all should collectively be concerned about contamination from floodwaters. So the categories that I would be considering or be seeking further advisement on would be biological contaminants, chemical contaminants, and other types of residues. With horses, fortunately, we do not then have to worry about sort of the second tier effect, where not only is there a question about animal health, but also about product safety of the products that those animals are producing. And horses, again, we're not. Heather, why don't you go ahead and I'll fill back in later.
Okay. Yeah, to pick up where Kristen left off, I mean, obviously if hay was flooded, we've already made offers to everybody to be testing the hay for contaminants. So anybody who's selling hay that may have had hay flooded, obviously if it was dry hay and it got flooded, it's pretty much, it's a as far as hay to be harvested, we've recommended that farmers do not harvest silted hay because of all the reasons Kristen was talking about, all kinds of contaminants, and the silt alone, the dust, I mean, it's harmful to those farmers that are trying to harvest it, but also, harmful, could be potentially harmful to the animals as well. So we're requesting that farmers do not harvest that feed unless they absolutely have to for some reason. And then we have a whole protocol to sort of store and also look at fermentation and contaminants. But yeah, I mean, obviously you need to be communicating closely with whoever you're buying hay from. As far as sugars in the grasses, sugars are created through the photosynthesis process, and they are not necessarily, they are influenced by water, but mostly by sunlight. The conditions for grass growth have been great actually in our state this year because it's wet and it's actually cool, even though the humidity doesn't make it feel that way. But these 70, sort of higher 70-degree temperatures with plenty of water means lots of grass growth. And, we should see, a little bit higher sugar content than normal if it's cool. So that's the other thing. We usually get less lignin and more soluble fiber and sugars. So.
Thank you, Heather. I apologize for my vocal dogs with very poor timing. To augment Heather's comments, the question about resources for finding hay in the state, there is Abby, I believe the agency is putting together a resource list, but I can share one equine resource, and that is one that has existed for a little bit of time already. It's the Vermont Equine Hay Bank. It's run out of the Dorset Equine Rescue Facility. There is an application process, and it is intended for being able to provide people in unpredicted circumstances with a temporary supply of hay. So certainly this type of natural disaster would potentially qualify. So I would certainly direct people to there. And then I know that our laboratory in Randolph is working on protocols for being able to do, for instance, mycotoxin testing and that kind of thing. So that will be a service that will be available in the future, and the agency will certainly update people when that becomes available. Thank you.
Yeah, and for any of those resources, this is where reaching out to the agency's email address, which we can put back lower in the chat, which is the agr.floodresponse@vermont.gov. We can connect you to those resources. So there was a question back on the produce side. So what is the minimum time required or time recommended to wait before planting crops for human consumption, assuming that a site was underwater for many hours? So acknowledging that longer the better, but is there a minimum recommendation that's being offered?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at this, and then Vern and Becky could chime in. This is a question that the answer is basically it depends, and it can depend on the factors of the field, the duration of flooding, the types of hazards we would be concerned about in the floodwater, and the crops that you want to replant. So happy to have a more detailed discussion with you if you want to reach out to one of us. If you're looking for a general recommendation, the general recommendations we do have in the guidance documents, again, on our website. So please have a look at those as well. But time will be your friend for the microbial pathogens, so the bacteria that we're concerned about. Those will die off over time, or they should, and the longer you wait, the better. If you want to, we don't really have a minimum time frame, but if you're looking for some number to go by, I would probably recommend 60 days, potentially 30 days if it's lower risk. There are some lower risk factors going there. But the bottom line is that it would be much better, much safer to wait until next year for most crops that are going to be grown for human food. I'll leave it there. Vern, you might have more you want to chime in.
Well, I've taken to the analogy of people asking how much over the speed limit is it safe to drive? It's really up to you to determine that risk. And what would you do? You check your tires, you check your oil. Is it straight and flat? Is it dry? So it's analogous here. Going right back in is very risky just because there's been no time for things to break down and you don't know what's there. The type of crop is a big factor. If something is growing in the soil, touching the soil, so edible root crops not cooked, leafy greens on the surface, highest risk. Things that are going to grow up high and never touch the soil or are going to definitely get peeled and cooked, lower risk. But the challenge is there is no exact answer to that. I have been urging people source product from other places that hasn't been flooded, and then you can just not worry about that. The challenge we know is waiting means the season's getting shorter and it's harder to do and people are under economic duress. But if you're going to go in, you should do the due diligence of using the ANR Atlas if you don't know what's upstream from you and finding out if sewage treatment plants flooded or large manure lagoons, and definitely do at least the heavy metals testing to have some sense of what's going on, and washing produce with sanitizer. These are all risk avoidance steps, but there's no guarantee. It's not going to be zero risk if you go back in.
I think there's a question here. Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say to the flooded produce FAQs that Vern and Tucker and a bunch of other folks helped put together. But it walks you through the ANR Atlas, and that's a really helpful way to see what's like upstream of you and get a real awareness of what is coming down in terms of hazards, and then also kind of more defining the low risk, medium risk, high risk crops that Vern was just alluding to. So I think it's helpful to actually like take the time to walk through those steps.
I think there's a follow-up question. Oh, I'm sorry, Kira.
Hans, if you want to jump in to
Yep,
answer the question.
No, real quick, I was just going to add, I did not hear, and this is sort of a question, but I did not hear the variables or general variables of, say, planting through plastic. In other words, separating, having a barrier between the soil and edible portion of a crop coming in, as a potential risk reduction step. Maybe Tucker, if you could comment on that, if you think that has any legs for farmers. I've had some questions about that.
Yeah, so if I understand you right, the idea would be replanting, but on plastic could be a way to minimize some risk. And we do mention that in the guidance documents. I would say that that could be one way to help. The way that would be beneficial is that you'd be minimizing the contact between the soil and the edible portion of the crop. So I would say that would be work better for crops that are staked, probably like tomatoes would be example that are staked and also grown on plastic, and the likelihood of them touching the soil is going to be low, but you don't likely have enough time to replant tomatoes, would be my guess. So maybe that's not a good example. If you wanted to replant something like maybe cucumbers on plastic, those are still going to vine out and probably are going to have a chance of contacting the soil between the rows. So it's not a fail-safe solution, but it might be a technique that could be beneficial. But again, I would combine that with other choosing the crop, I think, is probably the most important piece. So again, happy to have those conversations with growers one-on-one where we can kind of talk through the various options and factors.
And Becky, I think you did a nice job sort of responding to Ash's question in the chat with some suggestions of rarely consumed raw, kind of lower risk crops.
I would add too that some growers are using that guidance to, you know, if anything does survive, to really like clear off that plant of anything edible and let it refruit. So winter squash, for instance, which is like in the lower risk category and might be on mulch, to like clear off any flowers or fruit that was there. Same with eggplant, peppers. I know it's a lot of work, but they're, you know, creative ideas.
Great. Maybe there's a few questions in the chat that kind of shift us back to forage crops. I just thought I would see if there were any other questions kind of in the virtual room on produce specifically.
This is
At this
Daniel
time.
Boyd at the Boyd Family Farm.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
I just wanted to say the last little bit there was really what I was waiting to hear from, was the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants. We had a lot of the flood where it just came up just to the bottom of those plants. Really just barely touched the bottom of the stems in many of the rows. And the upper fruit that had formed, we went through and removed the day after the flood. And I was just kind of waiting on that to hear on that. So that was very helpful. And then the only other question was like baby carrots and stuff like that. That's an absolute no-go, even if they had just germinated. Any root crops like potatoes, like I had a late planting of potatoes that were impacted. The tubers hadn't formed. It's just the seed potatoes with big bunches of white roots. And I was wondering if there's any chance of that. You know, they'll be harvested in mid-September, end of September, and they had just broke through the hill. So like, would that still be completely out?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. The carrots are straightforward. They would be a no on that. There's high risk for them to be contaminated growing in that soil from the flood water. The potatoes are a little bit different. If you're absolutely sure that they haven't started making tubers yet, then potatoes are usually cooked before they're eaten. so they fall into that category. And if the edible portion hasn't started developing, technically those could potentially be salvaged and allowed to crop. However, I would strongly caution that they're still growing in soil that's likely contaminated, and there's risk for cross-contamination throughout the whole time period that they're growing there. So the safest thing would be to not harvest those, but yeah, I think that would be my best advice to you, is to not. But from the guidance we receive from FDA, which is kind of the ultimate authority on this, would categorize the potatoes differently than the carrots because the edible portion hasn't started growing yet.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that input. I'm gonna have to leave the meeting because I'm in the middle of stuff, but I just want to thank you all for all your work, and good luck to everyone.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate that, and same to you. There was a question, yes, and maybe Becky, you've just responded to this around, thinking ahead to next spring and whether cover cropping and what kind of soil remediation might be necessary before next 2024 growing season.
Yeah, I would just add that for all growers, even folks with saturated soils, this is an important point, is there's like a huge loss of microbe activity when, it's like 48 hours, I think, of saturation, you lose a lot of nutrients and microbial like activity that will release more nutrients. So cover cropping, I think, is, from the literature I've reviewed, like the most effective way to revive the soil health. So we're hoping to get cover crop seed out to a lot of growers.
All right, I see a hand at Boyd Family Farm. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not.
Yeah, we hear you great.
Our garlic crop. I came in a little bit late, so I apologize if this has been addressed already. While we may not be able to sell it this year, is it also not wise to dry it and save it for seed next year?
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, the answer is still no.
Okay.
There is some evidence that suggests that some of the contaminants could be internalized into the crop, and for something like seed garlic, maybe the risk is low, but it would still be considered contaminated if it was in the floodwater.
Very good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I know there was one around dried herbs. Do you guys want to just touch on that one also?
Sure. If they were in floodwater, directly in contact, and it's the harvestable portion that someone would eat, then those can't be harvested or sold. They're considered adulterated, is the technical term by FDA. And unfortunately, the answer is no. That's kind of some of these questions fall into a kind of a gray area, but this area is very black and white. If it's a food crop for humans and it was in the floodwater and it's the edible portion, it unfortunately cannot be harvested, can't be sold.
Ed, was there a question that you had? It looks like you came off mute.
Nope.
Okay, just wanted to check. I'd like to, I don't know that we have missed any kind of produce related questions in the chat. If I have, someone please kind of correct me.
Abby, there was a
yeah.
question, and I'm finding it it may not be terribly helpful for me to continue to put an answer in the chat. So perhaps I could just answer the question about the heavy metals
Sure.
and the petroleum-based contaminants. One thing for those of you who manage livestock, what I would say is it would be good to do a walkabout of your grazing pastures or your forage crop pastures or forage crop fields, because the floodwaters certainly have the potential to dislodge things that could lead to those types of contaminants. Spent car batteries, tractor batteries is a really common, awful way for livestock to ingest large amounts of lead, especially if those get baled up in hay bales and or ground up in silage. So take a walkabout, have a look at your pastures. In general, those types of heavy metals and petroleum-based products do have the ability to stick around longer than some biological pathogens. So it's really important. There may be things you can't see, but there also may be physical things that are in your pastures that didn't used to be there, and those you would be time well spent to do a review and remove those. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I just want to, yeah, Darren. I see your hand raised.
I just kind of wanted to follow up on that garlic question too, and thinking about some other produce. In cases like that, is there any way at the end of the season or the growing for the crop to do any of the value-added kind of processes, cooking, roasting, boiling, any of that would then make the produce safe or sellable?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The answer is a hard no for human food. If you're considering trying to recondition that crop and potentially use it for animal food, that is outside my scope. I think maybe perhaps there might be some options there, but I would defer to the other panelists on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I might use this kind of moment to both share some general resources and questions that are showing up in the chat, and then make the transition to forage crops. Not that we can't come back to produce for human consumption, we certainly can. Just acknowledging that this information and the kind of the outcome of this guidance is not necessarily easy to hear and has both business and financial and emotional impacts and ramifications on people as individuals and on your businesses. And so just acknowledging Farm First as a resource to connect with. So you can reach out to Farm First counselors to have one-on-one conversations. There's also 16, and Eva is here and she can speak to it for a moment, but peer farmers that you can also connect with and have real conversation with. So Eva, do you want to just offer a quick moment about Farm First?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, Farm First is here. I think they shared the website in the chat. It's farmfirst.org, and you can call me. My number, I also put it in the chat, is 802-318-5538. And yeah, and I can provide some resource coordination. I can connect you to other places that might be able to help with things like financial support or debt negotiation or any number of different things. And then also can connect you to free counseling for short-term counseling needs. I think we do up to 12 free sessions, and then also can connect you to the peer farmers in the peer program. And they're really a wonderful resource as well. So yeah, we're ready and willing and eager to help folks however we can.
And Eva, just to Representative Austin's question around just some concern for non-English speaking farmers, do you want to speak? My understanding is you also have the ability to provide kind of translation and support for Spanish speaking population as well.
I do know that we have some connections that do Spanish language translation specifically, I think within the Agency of Agriculture, and we've had some outreach to a lot of farmers and farm workers that I think don't speak English as their first language. I am not especially familiar right off the top of my head with other resources we may have for translation, but I did note that question, and it's something I'm going to follow up on with my supervisors. I've been here for a couple of months, so there's still some things that I'm learning about some of the other resources that we offer to folks, but definitely we'll plan on following up on that, and we'll maybe try to reach out to Representative Austin directly to answer that question after I know a little more.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And appreciate the kind of acknowledgement and kind of call to the fact that, you know, this is an educational, informational session provided in English only at this time. So recognizing that that makes it not as accessible to non-English speaking or non-English as a first language speaking individuals.
And actually, on that note, I might also want to put out that that farmers who experience disability of any kind, whether that's mental health or an intellectual or learning disability or physical disability, who might need some support with things like filling out forms, etc. Well, you could reach out to me, and I have some resources that I can connect you to. And I also just spoke with Nick Moreland at VCIL yesterday, and he's ready and willing to offer support to folks that might need something like that. So maybe I can get his contact information in here as well to be sharing with folks. And hold on, I'll put it in the chat in just one moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, maybe opening it up if there's any questions on the forage and field crop side, corn, pasture, hay. I know there was one question around timeline around drilling seed. I have to kind of go way back up. This was a bit ago. Someone might make it there faster than I do, but. Yeah, so how do we know for sure when it's time to till versus drill seed? And if we till, should we consider putting an annual in to assure proper coverage protection along with perennial grasses to protect against erosion?
Yeah, well, I think all of those questions depend on each individual's unique situation, but it's still really wet out. So I know that most anybody I know hasn't been able to even get on their fields that were really flooded with equipment anyway. And some people have tried to start picking up, but you know, it's very, very wet still. Once it dries out enough, certainly you know, at any point you could go out and start preparing the fields. I mean, if the fields are dead, you might want to consider reseeding. I've seen a few of those that I'm assuming are going to die. They're still underwater. So you might, you know, consider reseeding those, or if they're partially damaged, you might consider going out with a no-till drill and trying to fill them in. So if this is a perennial forage field, then a new seeding with perennial forages should really, in most parts of Vermont, be in the ground before Labor Day. So once we get towards September, we're kind of running out of time to reseed fields with perennial forages. Do you use an annual crop, or what we would call with forage seedings a nurse crop or a companion crop? We generally don't in the fall. I do realize it can definitely help provide more cover and suppress weeds, etc. But usually in the fall time, we're really just focused on getting the forage established, because it doesn't need any competition, you know, and competition from another annual might keep that from establishing. If you're just, you know, like Becky said, you really are trying to rebuild the soil, protect the ground, get something out there, you're able to get out there right away, then yes, you know, I would advocate for some type of cover crop. Generally, we start planting oats, peas, kind of cooler season crops by mid-August. And so, that's likely what you would want to be putting in, crimson clover, vetch, things like that, to start rebuilding the soil, and not doing a new forage seeding. I'm not sure if that helps. And there's others on this call too that could chime in as well.
Anyone else want to jump in on that response to that question?
Well, I think it's just, we're at an interesting time if, to rush to get warm season crops in before it's appropriate to plant the cooler crops, especially if the soil is still too wet to properly work. Doesn't make sense. So it isn't that long till you can call it mid-August and go with the cooler season covers.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people ask about planting warm season crops, for forages to help recover some of the feed. I'm sorry, I'm out at the farm now. But we're getting really too late for most of those. And really by the time I think people are going to be able to get on the fields, we're going to be into cooler season cover crops and forages. So
another couple related questions. One was an earlier question around how much silt is acceptable to be left on the fields after cleaning up debris. In this example, it's a mixed grass hay piece.
Yeah, again, I think I've seen the grasses grow up. I mean, if you can still see some grass, it's probably gonna try to push up through there. Some of the bigger worry I often see is that the silt isn't deposited evenly across the field. So sometimes people are in a situation where they have 2 feet of silt in one spot and nothing in another spot. And so then, they're forced with trying to figure out how to really move some of that silt around and spread it out, probably 3 inches. Possibly, the grass should grow back up through it. The grass should be, if the soils have drained, or at least there's no water in them anymore, they should be trying to regrow. I mean, honestly, I feel like we'll know more about what is going to live out there in even another week. And based on the weather forecast, we're not going to be out there doing much this week, probably next week either. So in some cases, I think, it's a wait and see, but probably just a few inches, before somebody probably has dead spots and suppression of growth.
So there's another question around stored hay that was damaged. Not any more detail about that, but the question being, should we throw it out or can someone use it?
Yeah, for mulch maybe. It depends, but not even that. It's probably contaminated with who knows what. I think people are always surprised, or I always have been, during other floods I've dealt with farmers, is wraparound bales. Water gets in there, even though you wouldn't think it would. It keeps oxygen out, but water can get in. So, even if you think it's not contaminated because of that, we need to core and sample that feed to see what's happened. But no, I mean, it should not be fed. I mean, some people, if you're desperate, we can talk about things, but same with produce. Animals could get really sick. So, I mean, Kristen, you might want to chime in on that.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I would at least I would definitely have that product tested, as well as give it the human test also. If it's off color, bad odor, anything like that, then don't even bother laboratory testing it. But if it looks good, then testing for mycotoxins, Clostridium botulinum, botulism is another thing to be concerned about, and all the other things we've talked about. So that would be a fairly high risk product if it was impacted by floodwaters and already stored up, baled, or otherwise.
And any thoughts if that damage was from humidity alone, not from being flooded?
Could be.
Maybe there wouldn't be the overt contamination, but there would still be the types of issues that can develop from excessive moisture. So the mycotoxins are first that come to my mind. But sorry, Heather, go ahead.
No, I mean, same. Could be any and all of the above. We know what happens when hay gets wet, so contaminants or not, they come. What if they weren't flooded into the hay, they will come with the moisture that's in there now.
So there's another technical question that I want to get to, but then before we wrap up in the next few minutes, a question around payment for damaged crops, like our funds anticipated and heading our way. So I just want a few folks to kind of be prepared to kind of respond to that question before we wrap. But to this other technical question, how should farmers handle tall corn crops that have been completely destroyed but are still standing in the field? Should they let them completely die in the field and deal with it next spring following breakdown over the winter, or think about some sort of management this fall or summer?
$1 million question, Tom. Yeah. I've been, and I'm sure you have too, around to a lot of farms with completely flattened corn. Looks like a steamroller went out there and put it down on the ground. And then we have others that are like partially flat and trying to come back up, and we just don't know what's going to happen. I've talked to a lot of farmers about options, what people have done in the past. It's funny, I haven't heard from anybody about what they've done in the past. What I have heard is that this is completely different from any other flood that they've ever been involved in, even though in the Winooski and those in the Lamoille that always have flooded crops or regularly. So this is very, very different for people. I did see corn dead yesterday down in Rutland that was already rotting and decomposing. And my assumption is that will all be gone, probably maybe, definitely by next spring. So I think it really will depend on the situation. We have a lot of no-till fields in the floodplain now, which is really great, something we've moved to over time. And now farmers are talking about going out there with paddle plows and trying to, basically rip up all that no-till and incorporate the corn. We don't want them to do that. So we've been trying to think about options to get some larger brush hogs in here, like the state would use, big batwing mowers, to try to chop the corn up a bit. And then, leave it there to let it decompose. A lot of those farms in the floodplain, they try to plant cover crops, but the cover crops get flooded too. So I don't know, Tom. I think we need to get together and try to hash this out. Seems like people are going to try different approaches. So I don't have a great answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, is it's very site specific, and then there may not be great answers right now in all cases, which is frustrating. Maybe we do want to just address the funding question. There were, and maybe still are, a fair number of folks from NRCS and FSA on this call. I don't know if anyone on the call is interested in speaking up. The agency, and Nina, if you're wanting to speak to this, is contemplating sort of a part 2 session to this call for next week that's focused on the funding component. So less on the technical, kind of what should I what should I do in the field, but more on the financial assistance side and understanding the available programs. Anyone want to speak to that in any greater detail?
If Eileen or John want to chime in, I can prep you. But in terms of disaster recovery and relief, the Farm Service Agency is the primary mechanism for reporting damages at this time. If you have damaged crops and you haven't had the opportunity to visit your local FSA office to provide them with information regarding your losses, we highly recommend that you get in touch and do so. There are a variety of programs. They're all very complex. I'm not going to attempt to describe them all, but it includes resources for feed and livestock losses, as well as additional measures to repair fields after flood damage. So if you have not had the opportunity to visit your local FSA office and report your damages at this point in time, we highly recommend that you do so. And we do anticipate offering some additional sort of educational webinars in the coming weeks, and we will do our best to distribute and disseminate information about those as they are developed and organized. And John, if you'd like to add anything.
No, Nina, you're hired as an FSA employee. So no, I don't think I have anything more to add at this point. I think you did very well. And yeah, please reach out to our offices. And we basically cover, crops, livestock damage, field damage, that sort of thing, along with our partners at NRCS. And yes, unfortunately, it is not easy and straightforward. Sometimes it is complicated. But perseverance, and our staff are waiting to help you in any way they can. So, thanks.
Thanks, John. Any other last thoughts or questions in our final minute here? I will note that the Agency of Agriculture is in the process of finalizing an impact survey similar to one that we may have released and that you all have seen access to in the beginning of COVID-19 times. And this is to really try to quantify loss and impact of crops and markets and infrastructure as a result of this flood. So we're intending that the survey will be available by the end of this month, so another week away before we'll release it. It's designed to be pretty quick, but a nice aggregate sampling of reaching as many farms as possible to use that information to help guide the access and demand for future state and federal resources. So you'll see that survey come out probably be announced on the 30th and then live on the 31st. Another message coming from our agency this Sunday as part of our e-newsletter that goes out every Sunday is just some of the quick tips that we've talked about and have been circulated widely around what should you do first, and sort of trying to help streamline the messaging to help people know what some important first steps would be as you're facing the response to this flood situation and emergency. So everyone's doing a lot to be helpful. There's a lot of businesses that are doing what they can to recover, and really appreciate everyone's time and effort and coordination and care for one another. So thanks for taking the time to be here today. Continue to reach out to all these individuals that have so much expertise and support to offer. And hopefully see you for another similar call next week to talk about programs and resources. Good to see everyone. Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.